So today we're talking about a guy named Gideon who struggles with trusting God, but then later on follows his instructions to a T.
So we're going to see that victory is possible even if we struggle with fear, but only when we do what God says. So that's what's next on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify, or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So Jeff,
Yes.
yesterday you asked me about Superman and Batman.
Yeah, that's right.
On the podcast. So I have a question for you.
Okay.
Because DC is such a bad franchise in my mind, although not bad comic books.
Right.
Just bad franchise and movies.
Sure. They're not the best movies.
No, they're not the best movies. So let's talk about just one question, which is out of all of the Marvel movies, right, that they made a part of the timeline of the greatness of Marvel.
Yeah.
What is your favorite Marvel movie?
Oh, yeah. I think I have two equally favorite. They're the only two I've watched more than once. So I love the original Doctor Strange movie. I think that's fantastic. And I love the original Captain America movie. So those would be my two favorites. And about equal. Yeah.
Now, you know that by the time that listeners listen to this, Doctor Strange will have already come out, the Madness one.
Yeah, I think
the
so.
Multiverse.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah, are you?
Yeah. So I've only seen one trailer, so I don't really understand everything that's going on. But I love the ideas of messing around with time. Time is always a very interesting thing to me.
Yeah.
And I think that came from when I was a teenager. I read Einstein's theory of relativity, and it just was really cool to me, the idea that you can speed it up, slow it down. It seems like we can bend it a little bit. So then to be able to get a guy like Doctor Strange and really, really mess with it is cool. So
Yeah, well, I too became fascinated with time when Marty McFly went back and dated his mom. Well, I shouldn't say that part, but
well, there's also a doctor in that one too. What was the doc's name?
Such a weird movie. Doc Brown.
Doc Brown, yeah. So Doc Brown, Einstein, they're almost the same. They both had a big influence on our lives,
and they both had crazy hair.
Yeah, that's right.
It's so funny.
Well, today we're looking at another one of these guys. Of all of the judges, he might be the least superhero-ish, but Gideon is already, he's already argued with an angel. And then finally, when he was convinced, he believed that he really was called to do this, he immediately stepped out, destroyed his family's altars, even though he was taking a risk, he was going to get punished. And then now here we are, that he's about ready to lead into a massive battle.
Yeah, and God said, I'm going to give you the victory. And so he's going to face incredible odds as we're about to read.
Yeah. So let's just jump into it. I'm going to start in Judges 6, verse 33. We'll read through chapter 7, but it gives you some of the prelude here in verse 33. It says, soon afterward being soon after he had destroyed his father's altars, right? Soon afterward, the armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east formed an alliance against Israel and crossed the Jordan, camping in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon with power, which is such a cool phrase. The Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon with power. He blew a ram's horn as a call to arms, and the men of the clan of Abiezer came to him. He also sent messengers throughout Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, summoning their warriors, and all of them responded. Then Gideon said to God, if you are truly going to use me to rescue Israel as you promised, prove it to me in this way. I'll put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I'll know that you're going to help me rescue Israel as you promised. And that is just what happened. When Gideon got up early the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out a whole bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, please don't be angry with me, but let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece for one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew. So that night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew. So Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and his army got up early and went as far as the spring of Harod. The armies of Midian were camped north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore, tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home. So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. But the Lord told Gideon, there are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I'll test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. And when Gideon took his warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, divide the men into 2 groups. In one group, put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it up with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouths in the stream. Only 300 of the men drank from their hands, and all the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. The Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men will I rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. So Gideon collected the provisions, the ram's horns of the other warriors, and sent them home. But he kept the 300 men with him. The Midian camp was in the valley just below Gideon. That night the Lord said, get up, go down into the Midianite camp, for I have given you victory over them. But if you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you'll be greatly encouraged, and then you'll be eager to attack. So Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. The armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east had settled in the valley like a swarm of locusts. Their camels were like grains of sand on the seashore, too many to count. Gideon crept up just as a man was telling his companion about a dream. The man said, I had this dream, and in my dream a loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp. It hit a tent, turned it over, knocked it flat. His companion answered, your dream can only mean one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite, victory over Midian and all its allies. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship before the Lord. And then he returned to the Israelite camp and shouted, get up, for the Lord has given you victory over the Midianite hordes. And he divided the 300 men into 3 groups and gave each one a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. And then he said to them, keep your eyes on me. When I come to the edge of the camp, do just as I do. And as soon as I and those with me blow the ram's horns, blow your horns too, all around the entire camp, and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. It was just after midnight, after the changing of the guard, when Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the Midianite camp. Suddenly they blew their ram's horns and broke their clay jars. Then all 3 groups blew their horns and broke their jars, and they held blazing torches in their left hands and the horns in their right hands. And they all shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And each man stood at his position around the camp and watched as all the Midianites rushed around in a panic, shouting as they ran to escape. When the 300 Israelites blew their ram's horns, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their swords. Those who were not killed fled to places as far away as Bethsheba near Zerera and to the border of Abel-Maholah near Tabbath. Then Gideon sent for the warriors of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, who joined in chasing the army of Midian. Gideon also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down to attack the Midianites, cut them off at the shallow crossings of the Jordan River at Beth-barah. So all the men of Ephraim did as they were told, and they captured Oreb and Zeb, the 2 Midianite commanders, killing Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb, and they continued to chase the Midianites. Afterward, the Israelites brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan River.
Wow.
Dude, this is one of the coolest battles in the Bible.
Oh, yeah. And you could do a 5-week series on this thing on the weekends. So let's sort of, there's a lot to cover. So let's jump in and start where the passage started, which is about the fleece and the dew, right? And so I think it's actually great because, we already sort of are introduced to Gideon. We know that he has some insecurities, and the angel says, Gideon, you're a mighty warrior. And he's like, you talking to me?
Yeah.
Because I'm not a mighty warrior. But yet he still does what he's told. But then right before he goes in the battle, he needs more encouragement. So he says, let the fleece be wet and the ground be dry, because we all know that if you lay something out, in fact, just last night, we had my daughter's graduation party, and my son left out our cornhole things, and so this morning there was dew on the ground, and all the bean bags were wet, and so I went out and I'm like, oh man, he left these out here, and I picked them up and they were all like dewy, right? Yeah. So this is what Gideon's doing. Right. He's actually saying like, okay, God, show me a mini miracle, and have dew be on everywhere except for the fleece, or have it be on the fleece, or he does it twice. Yeah. Anyway, here's my point. My point is this: is that God does it the first time. God honors his request. He doesn't have to. Right. And here's what Gideon does. Gideon's like, oh man, it happened just like I asked. And then something in his mind said, but maybe that just happened naturally. Yeah. Like maybe that wasn't a miracle. Maybe that was just science. Right. Right. And isn't that what we do sometimes? Sure. We try to explain away the miracles of God, and we say, well, I bet you that's just coincidence. We hear people give these unbelievable stories, and we go, well, that could have been coincidence.
Right.
So he's like, can you do me another one, God? Can you reverse
Exactly
it?
the opposite.
Yes.
Yeah, give me the exact opposite miracle this next time.
Yeah, and so then God did it.
Yeah,
which is great.
I think we're tempted to do the same thing. God has clearly spoken. His word is clear, right? We have the difference between Gideon's time and our time is we have the complete revelation of God in Scripture, and he didn't. So, we don't always need some kind of special revelation or some kind of sign. What we need to do is spend more time studying God's words because his words will tell us the direction we're supposed to go, what we're supposed to do. I think it's one of the benefits of doing these daily devotionals is to take in more and more and more of God's word. Peter tells us that God gave us all of these things for our example. And so the more we spend time in God's word, the less of a magical sign or mystical sign that we would feel like we need. He's looking for some kind of proof when God's word had already been spoken, you're going to win.
Right.
So,
yeah. And back then, of course, God operated differently. It'd be pretty amazing if God appeared to me and touched my, offering and consumed it and things like that. But, and then he goes into battle and as just, we just heard, he starts out with 32,000 men versus 135,000.
Right.
And then
that's going to be a rough battle.
That's going to be a rough battle.
Right.
And God says there's too many because it's kind of like the fleece, isn't it? It's the fleece and the dew. He's like, so if you win, you'll be like, well, I think it was just because we're such great warriors.
Right. Well, what would it have been? It would have been like 4.5 guys apiece.
Right.
So if we were really, really good warriors, we have to take out 4.5 of them in order to win.
Right. Everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Even then, the odds are stacked against you. But mighty warriors maybe could do that.
Yeah. And I love how he says, "Okay, tell everybody who's afraid to go home." And 22,000 out of the 32,000 are like, "Are you serious?
That's me.
Are you serious? Are we really allowed to? We won't be shot because I will go home right now."
I'm out of here.
And he's left with 10,000. And I love how God says it's still too many. And so, what a strange way to divide the next group of men.
Yeah.
He says, have them all go get a drink, and based on how they drink, divide them.
Yeah.
And have you ever heard the theory on this one?
Well, the 300 were observant and the others weren't.
Yes, that's what I've heard too. And again, we don't really understand that, but it's probably true. It seems true to me because God said those who just pretty much dunk their face in the stream and drink, get rid of those guys. But those who actually keep their head up and actually scoop the water up to their hand and drink from their hand, keep those men. And they would have had to have been the men who were still on the lookout.
Yeah.
They were the ones who, didn't just put their face in the stream. They were looking around them, being observant, which are the cunningest warriors.
Or it could just be that they had the best manners and God knew that only 300 people had manners.
Either way.
And 9,700 had bad manners. It might be it. I don't know. But whatever it was, what God was doing was he was teaching them not to trust in their own strength. This is what he's trying to teach Gideon. Because Gideon was afraid he couldn't fulfill God's mission because he wasn't a tough guy.
Right.
And God's saying, you don't need to be a tough guy. So he gets him down to 300 so that he can teach Gideon and the people of Israel, it's not by your own strength. It's not by your own cunning. It's not that you're self-sufficient. It's that I will do in you what I said I will do in you, right? And that was really it.
You know what this reminds me of? Remember when Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal?
Yes.
And you remember he said, not only is God going to demonstrate by demonstrating himself with fire, but I want you to pour water everywhere. Right?
Yeah.
And he's like,
make it even harder.
Just so that you know that the victory is God's.
Yeah.
We're going to douse it with water. Yeah. And this is what God's doing. God's saying, I'm not only going to give you the victory, I'm going to give you the victory with ridiculous odds.
Yeah.
And so then we see all sorts of supernatural, things that God has gone before Gideon in his battle, because he says, go down and listen to what the men are saying. Yeah. And so he sneaks down and he has this strange dream about barley bread. Right?
Yeah. This is such a cool dream, though.
It is such a cool dream.
Yeah. So barley was worth about half as much as wheat. And then, so half the, and then barley bread was viewed as inferior to wheat bread.
Right.
So this guy's dreaming that barley bread comes rolling down from the hills and wipes out the camp of the Midianites. And God is kind of hinting, in a miraculous way, he's hinting to Gideon, listen, you think you're half as good. You don't think you measure up. but I'm going to use you to wipe them out. And even the Midianites kind of knew it. At least those two Midianites did while they were talking about it.
Yeah, and it was probably literally, everybody knows that the Israelites are poor people, under-resourced, and they ate barley bread, right? So it's like you have half the resources, you have half the confidence, you have half the wealth.
Yeah.
You're inferior, and yet still, this is what the dream means.
Well, God's setting him up for understanding with the small army he's got, and then with this dream that the victory that they're going to gain is not their victory. It's God's victory in them, right? So I think we have to be careful not to take credit for the things that God does in us. We're partnering with him. We're doing what he told us to do. We're using our skills and the gifts that he's given us, but the victories are always God's. And it's after you begin to obey God, that's when you find the courage to move ahead. So God says, hey, listen, if you're a little nervous, just sneak down in the middle of the night to the camp. Dude, that's scary to me.
Yeah,
sneaking down to the camp,
right?
But he goes down to the camp, and God had already told him, you're going to hear some guy talk about a dream. And then he hears a guy talk about a dream.
Yeah, it's
that
incredible.
would just start to give you so much more confidence. God's building confidence, building confidence, building confidence. But it's when he begins to obey God is when you see God begin to move and make all these things begin to happen.
So, it's interesting because you and I would have no idea, like, how could 300 men defeat 135,000 warriors?
Right.
And then what ends up happening is because Gideon had collected very wisely all the ram's horns and all the materials from all the other people that had left and gone home, that these 300 men were left with these clay pitchers, these torches, these ram's horns. And, you take a horn of a ram and you blow in it, it makes a woo kind of sound, right? And so
you can imagine what 300 would sound like.
Right.
Right.
And by the way, just so our readers understand, that was reserved for the commander of a legion. Right. So like a legion would be 1,000 soldiers. So if you heard a ram's horn and then, all of a sudden, they break the clay pitcher and it reveals the lamp inside or the blazing torch that they had inside, all of a sudden now you're surrounded by these lights. Yeah. You wake up in the middle of the night.
Yeah, it's after midnight.
It's after midnight. Yeah. So you'd be waking up in the middle of the night, you'd look up on the hill and you would see that you're surrounded with 300 torches, thinking that each torch represented a legion, which means they're thinking 300,000 warriors versus 135,000.
Yeah.
They think they're outnumbered.
So you have to remember, when this is happening at midnight, they lived sun up, sundown kind of lifestyles. So it would have only been an hour or two after darkness. They would have all been in bed. They're probably in bed by 8:30, 9 o'clock. So by midnight, they're in deep sleep. This isn't like they just turned off the TV and went to bed 15 minutes ago.
Right.
They're in deep sleep. And it's in this deep sleep. Everybody's snoring, the whole camp. And then they're kind of in a valley, and there's almost a bowl. There's 3 sides to this valley area. And so he's got 100 on each side. And you're right. The lights, the horns, it would have sounded like they were surrounded by 300,000 people. And these guys get up, grab their swords. It's dark. It's in the middle of the night. They start fighting each other because they're in this full-blown panic.
Yeah. Well, you could imagine if you think there's 300,000 soldiers.
Oh, yeah.
And you get up and everybody starts panicking, everything that moves, you're going to stab.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's nighttime.
Exactly.
And you're like, oh, no, oh, no.
Yeah. Somehow they snuck past our guards. That's what you'd be thinking.
Right.
And so now the whole camp's just, covered. But God caused that confusion. That's that supernatural confusion.
That's important to understand, too. God caused them to be panicked, to be confused. Their spirit was already in fear, as we, observed by the dream. So it's just one of those things where, and again, it also reminds me of when God parted the Red Sea, when God gave Moses instructions and said, hey, here's my plan. Go and camp yourselves and trap yourselves against the Red Sea and then wait for the next move. And it's like, okay, God, aren't you going to give me anything more?
Right.
And in that moment, it's not as if Moses said, I know what God's going to do. He's going to part the Red Sea.
Right.
I can't even imagine Gideon being down to 300 men. Did he really know in that moment, I know what we're going to do, right? We're going to pretend like we have 300,000 men. But he gets this idea. Why? Because God sent him down there and he listened to a dream and thought, these men already believe we're going to win, so we're going to use that to our advantage. And so God sort of reveals the path. So Gideon follows in faith, not knowing the path, until the very last moment when he goes back and says, this is the moment. God's given these guys into our hand. And so he becomes this great warrior. I often think to myself, what a bluff.
Yeah.
Like, what a bluff. Had he had so much confidence in God. That's really it, isn't it?
Yes.
Because all they would have had to do is call the bluff. Charge up on the hill and they'd just find 300 men, and it'd be over in a second.
Right.
But yet, it wasn't the faith in necessarily the plan. It was faith in what he knew God was doing in the hearts of the enemy.
Right. I think can you imagine being one of those 300? Because they had the option to go home too, right? They could have just elected to get out of this. And sometimes I think we abandon what could be some of the greatest miracles in our lives too soon. We're a little afraid. There's an out. We start getting nervous. But can you imagine being one of those 300 men, 25 years later, sitting there with their grandchildren saying, "Let me tell you a story. I was there," right? Because they would have all known it. Because God, winds up over the next little while wiping out the Midianites, just wiping them out, using Gideon and the soldiers. But it began on this day. So give us a final thought as we wrap up.
Yeah, so the final thought is that, when it comes down to it, when God gives a promise, even though that we don't understand it, even though that we don't comprehend it, and even if we might have fear during it, we just have to trust in the promise. Because isn't it true, every time God asks us to do something, whether small or big, we struggle with three things, with fear, with understanding, and with probability.
Yeah.
And we think to ourselves, I don't understand it. The odds are great, and I'm fearful. And yet if God says it, then we need to move forward and just trust God, because looking back, oftentimes in our lives, we say, oh, that's what God's up to.
Right.
And I never would have guessed it. I never would have understood it.
Yeah.
So, and so many times in my life, I could actually look back and think to myself, oh, that's how God worked that out.
Acting on that obedience is what brought out the promise of God. If they hadn't acted, they wouldn't have ever seen the promise.
That's great.
That's great, man.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and see you next time as we continue to talk about the judges of Israel.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.